Let's talk about what happens because you have great protocols for helping those that have really gone over the high side with this. What do you see in the first few days when you're detoxing someone from this digital heroin, digital crack? What do you see with these kids when you're going through detox in a treatment center?
Yeah, so we do a digital detox for the first 6 weeks, and you see exactly the same response you would when somebody's detoxing, primarily off of a stimulant. It looks, because this is a stimulant, this is adrenal arousing, adrenergic, and dopaminergic. So in the same way that usually in the first 48 to 72 hours, really aggressive types of behavior, really sort of impulsivity, you see a lot of reactivity. In the same way that if any of your viewers try to stop drinking coffee and you get irritable, you get moody, but that tends to taper off after the second or third day, and people tend to kind of go back to their baseline. But parents don't want to push through that. When parents are trying to sort of go through this detox process at home, anytime Johnny or Susie gets irritable, they sort of give in to the hostage demands, and they give the devices back. They're not willing to push through the uncomfortable period. And I get it. I understand it's not easy to do that. We have a hard enough time doing it in a structured, facilitated residential treatment environment.
Right. It's difficult when you're so involved and you hate to see your child hurting and uncomfortable and hear the things that they say. They actually become aggressive oftentimes during these first few days, right?
I've had multiple parents who have been assaulted. The police were involved. When I've gone to some of the homes of my clients, the telltale signs, the holes in the sheetrock, the explosive anger that happens. So, and that's why it is a little bit, be careful. Maybe it's not always depending on how severe your son is or your daughter is, how explosive they've been. Sometimes it's not the most safe thing in the world to do this without professional assistance. People can get aggressive.
Yeah, I tell them it may be just over their pay grade, and you and I are dealing with some examples and stories very soon where the child can panic. There have been suicide situations. There have been situations where kids get homicidal because they're so immature. Yeah. If a gun is handy or they do something, again, it's like the perfect storm, right? You have problems with the impulse control centers, which aren't developed and then are further eroded. You've got the withdrawal effects, and it's just a perfect storm where this can go really bad.
It's like taking away a drug from a drug addict while they're not thinking straight and they're irrational. You're exactly right. So that in my book, I was able to document there were at least a dozen cases here in the U.S. of matricide or patricide, where a young male gamer killed their parent in this perfect storm that you described situation. And more often than not, because I looked at each of the case studies pretty deeply, these weren't, how can I put this? These weren't kids that were born bad. These weren't kids that were hardwired. But in most of these cases, these kids were actually good kids who sort of fell down the rabbit hole and lost themselves.
It's interesting. Sometimes it builds up across a matter of weeks or months, and some are really highly susceptible. Clearly, they were predisposed, and they can go down that rabbit hole in a matter of a few days.
Yeah, I've seen that. I know, we'll be talking to, I think, a guest of yours that was that kind of an example. And we know that there are some kids that are more predisposed to be vulnerable. It is a little bit of Russian roulette. I've seen the 3-letter athlete, honor student fall down the rabbit hole. And then we've also seen the kids who had the more historically challenging mental health issues. Because if you're, some of these issues are what we would call bidirectional forces. If you're depressed and you feel self-loathing, and you're a gamer, these gaming platforms, you're achieving a sense of success. You're actually leveling up. It might be the only part of your life that if you're a young man, you're feeling a sense of accomplishment in. I analogize it with like a violin virtuoso. You've got somebody that's admittedly devoting 10, 12 hours a day to their passion, in this case, gaming or the violin. And then you're asking them all of a sudden to stop it because you don't have any balance in your life. All the telltale signs of addiction. It's adversely affecting your daily functioning. You have no social relationships. Your academics are failing. You have no social relationships. Well, at a certain point, does it come time to put down the violin? Even if you're the best violin player in the world, you don't have a life anymore. And so I've seen, we see a higher propensity with male gamers with on the spectrum. If you have any kind of Asperger's or spectrum disorder, you're more likely to perseverate on screen experiences. But it also happens to the most healthy, and it's hard to predict who might be vulnerable to these effects.
Well, I've had relationships with families in the past that have had Olympians and pro athletes where the child was so focused on that one sport, whether it was a gymnast or a tennis player or whatever, that everything else in their life was pushed to the side. And they really did suffer burnout at a real early age. They got to the point where they said, look, I don't want to spend 9 hours a day sacrificing and eating a certain way and training and living like a monk. I'd like to go to the mall. I'd like to eat popcorn. I'd like to hang out. But the rest of their life just suffered because they were so devoted to that one thing. And I can see it happening with these kids. At some point, they're going to wake up and say, hey, I've missed out on life. Now, let me ask you something about gaming, because I've seen the research that, much to the surprise of parents, said that the violent video games did not predict that those playing them would then go do that in real life. The research that I had seen is 10 or 12 years old. Since then, these games have become more realistic, more interactive. The characters in the games can be now role play characters with the person playing them, and they're so much more realistic. Does that still hold true? Does playing those violent games not predict that they will go out and do that in life?
Yeah, well, no, well, so increased aggression is the byproduct. Now, whether increased aggression leads to a school shooting, that's the $64,000 question. Craig Anderson at the University of Iowa, he's been sort of the grand wizard of aggression and violent media research for 25 years. They've conclusively said violent media leads to increased aggression. Now, again, as I said, does increased aggression mean I'm going to shoot up the school, or does it mean I'm going to kick my sister or maybe take a punch at someone more? But it definitely leads to increased aggression. And the more realism involved, the more you raise the amplitude of that aggression, the more you desensitize folks to violence. We used to say back in the day, if you watched Bugs Bunny or Wile E. Coyote, that was violent cartoon content, but it was not real. They did specific studies where they looked at, they used as variables things like there was one video game where they did it without sound effects, and then they did it with blood and without blood. And the more realistic it became when they added a modification of blood, when they added a modification of sound, like in Grand Theft Auto 4, they added when you would hit the prostitute with a baseball bat, which is, this is a game our 8-year-olds are playing, you would hear the thump, thump, thump. So the more realistic, the more the amplitude of the aggression raised. So, some of these games right now, they're, especially with the virtual reality added dimension. So a lot of our kids are reality blurred. I've worked with, my first entree into this whole arena was a 16-year-old who was referred to me who was having an episode of digital or video game psychosis. And he was playing World of Warcraft 12 hours a day. And he was Dr. Phil. He was in the Matrix. He didn't know where the game ended and where reality began.
Wow.
He was in the full dissociative state and had no psychiatric background. There was no family history of psychosis. This was a kid who hadn't slept for days, had been in this immersive world, and now had a psychotic break and had to wind up getting psychiatrically hospitalized. He got put on antipsychotics, which was a mistake. He shouldn't have been given antipsychotics because all he needed was to get some sleep and to unplug for 2 or 3 days. But then he went down the psychiatric, they treated him like a genuine psychotic patient, which he wasn't. But we've seen that, we've seen how hyperrealism and immersion can really impact people in ways that they can then lead to violent episodes. And we've had, school shootings. I like to say there's a statistic where not all gamers, of course, are going to be violent or school shooters, but every school shooter has been a gamer. And there's not just the desensitization that happens when you're playing these violent games, but there's also the social contagion effect of when I'm a lost, empty outlier, whether I'm an incel, like sometimes now they're speculating that the Idaho murderer is an incel, and you find community in some of these online chat rooms, and these communities now sort of begin to inflame your aggression or anger, and you're finding role models, because let's face it, when Columbine happened in 1999, Columbine was the first internet school shooting. And before Columbine, there had only been the Texas Tower shooting in 1966 with a brain-damaged Marine. You had Columbine in the era of the internet, and then copycat after copycat after copycat. And the FBI had even said, these kids are emulating, because let's face it, social learning theory, we know that we live our lives by emulating role models. And once you put that out into the ether, Adam Lanza, the Connecticut school shooter in Newtown, Connecticut, the FBI had found at home, he had a butcher block sheet of paper with every serial killer on it with a point total next to their names, and he was trying to be, quote unquote, high score. And the one FBI investigator said he was convinced he was in a fully psychotic episode playing out a fantasy video game. Adam Lanza had been playing a game called School Shooter, where the player in the video game goes classroom to classroom shooting students. So you tell me whether that impacted that young man's horrible mass murder.
I've said for decades, if I wanted to make someone psychotic and I could only control one variable, it would be sleep disturbance. If I keep somebody awake long enough, I think I can make anybody break. These kids that are staying up for days and days playing these things endlessly, and then they have all this stimulus coming in, that's part of that perfect storm that can happen on the gaming side.
The sleep disturbance gets underappreciated by parents. Oh, Johnny's up in his room. He's up till 4 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Hebb was a researcher back in the 50s who did research on isolation, sleep deprivation, and some sensory deprivation. And he got these college students, of course, they get these grad students to, participate for $10 in the study. But he wanted to see, and this was research that he was really doing for enhanced interrogation, and what would happen if after 2 weeks of taking some of these young people and having them be sleep deprived, they wore blindfolds and mittens on their hands. They didn't have any sense of time or awareness of what was happening that way. What would happen after 2 weeks of them not sleeping? And none of them made it past 72 hours. And if you read the transcripts of that study, they were all hallucinating by 48 to 72 hours. One of the graduate students wrote about seeing 6-foot bunny rabbits jumping around. All of them went psychotic just from the sleep deprivation part of it. So you're right. Sleep deprivation and hyper-immersive synthetic realities, digital realities, are a recipe for disaster.